Plantagenets, England's longest dynasty documentary. Imagine, if you will, a Europe in chaos. The year is 1128. The Great Norman Experiment in England is barely half a century old, and already the whole thing is teetering on the edge of collapse. The king, Henry I, has one legitimate son, and that son has just died in a shipwreck that would become the stuff of legend. The White Ship, a disaster that plunged an entire kingdom into uncertainty, into the abyss of what would become 19 years of civil war. But from that wreckage, from that chaos, something extraordinary would emerge. A dynasty that would rule England for 331 years. 14 kings, 6 of them from cadet branches that would tear each other apart. A dynasty that would give us the Magna Carta, the 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, and some of the most extraordinary and terrifying characters ever to wear a crown. This is the story of the Plantagenets. Let's start with the name itself, because it's peculiar, isn't it? Plantagenet. It doesn't sound particularly English. It doesn't sound particularly royal either. It sounds like a plant. And that's exactly what it is. The name comes from the Latin Plantagenista, the broom plant. Now you might ask yourself, why would a royal dynasty name itself after a common shrub? The answer lies with a man called Geoffrey, Count of Anjou. Geoffrey was a French nobleman from the region of Anjou, a man with a reputation for being strikingly handsome. They called him Geoffrey the Handsome, or Geoffroy le Bel. He had a habit, apparently, of wearing a sprig of yellow broom blossom in his hat. Maybe it was a fashion statement. Maybe it was a family emblem. Whatever the reason, the nickname stuck. Geoffrey Plantagenet. Now, here's the thing about the name Plantagenet that most people don't realize. It wasn't used as a surname by the kings themselves for more than 250 years. The first official use of it as a royal surname didn't happen until 1460, when Richard, Duke of York, claimed the throne as Richard Plantagenet. Historians have retroactively applied the name to the entire dynasty. It's convenient, it's useful, but it's also slightly misleading. The kings themselves would have thought of themselves as Angevins from Anjou. The Plantagenet label is something we've given them. But let's go back to Geoffrey, because without him, none of this happens. Geoffrey V of Anjou was born in 1113. He inherited the counties of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine in 1129. He was a capable ruler, a competent soldier, but what made him truly significant wasn't anything he did himself. It was who he married. In 1128, Geoffrey married Matilda, and Matilda was no ordinary noblewoman. Matilda was the daughter of King Henry I of England. She was also the widow of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, which meant she could call herself Empress, a title she clung to with fierce determination for the rest of her life. She was proud, she was brilliant, and she had a claim to the English throne that would make her the center of one of the most brutal civil wars in English history. When Henry I's only legitimate son died on the White Ship in 1120, Matilda became his heir. Henry made his barons swear allegiance to her, not once but multiple times. But the English barons, for all their oaths, had a problem with the idea of a woman on the throne. This was the 12th century. The idea of female rule was, to put it mildly, controversial. So when Henry I died in 1135, Matilda's cousin Stephen of Blois acted fast. He crossed the channel, had himself crowned king, and basically said, Sorry, cousin, but I'm sitting in this chair now." Matilda was not amused. What followed was 19 years of chaos, a period so dreadful that contemporaries called it the Anarchy. It wasn't a neat, contained war with clear battle lines and chivalrous rules. It was a grinding, miserable conflict of sieges, raids, betrayals, and atrocities. Castles were built everywhere, each one a center of local tyranny. The countryside was pillaged. Law and order collapsed. One contemporary chronicler, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, painted a picture of absolute horror. They wrote that men said openly that Christ and his saints slept. The kingdom, in other words, had been abandoned by God. Matilda fought hard. She had moments of spectacular success. In 1141, she actually captured Stephen and had herself proclaimed Lady of the English. But she never managed to get herself crowned. She alienated the people of London with her arrogance, and eventually she had to flee the city, escaping across the frozen Thames in a desperate retreat. The war ground on, year after year, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. But Matilda had one advantage that Stephen didn't have: a son. A son who would grow up to be everything his mother wanted him to be, and more. That son was Henry. Henry was born in 1133 in Le Mans, France. His father was Geoffrey of Anjou, the broom-wearing count. His mother was the Empress Matilda. He was, in every sense, a product of the two most powerful families in Western Europe. From his mother, he inherited a claim to the English throne. From his father, he inherited Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. And from his mother's first marriage, in a roundabout way, he inherited absolutely nothing. But that didn't matter, because he was about to acquire something far more valuable. In 1150, when Henry was just 17, King Louis VII of France made him Duke of Normandy. The following year, his father died, and Henry became Count of Anjou. He was now one of the most powerful nobles in France, but he was about to become even more powerful through the most important marriage of the 12th century. Eleanor of Aquitaine was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable women in European history. She was the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, the heiress to vast territories in southwestern France that dwarfed the domains of the French king himself. She had been Queen of France as the wife of Louis VII, and she had gone with him on the disastrous Second Crusade. She was beautiful, intelligent, willful, and utterly formidable. But her marriage to Louis VII had been annulled in 1152. The official reason was consanguinity. They were too closely related. The real reason was that Eleanor had given Louis 2 daughters and no sons, and the French king, like most medieval monarchs, desperately needed a male heir. Eleanor was now free, and she was the richest marriage prize in Europe. She didn't stay free for long. Just 8 weeks after her annulment, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet. He was 19, she was about 30. The age difference didn't matter. What mattered was that Henry now controlled Aquitaine, as well as Anjou, Normandy, and all his other territories. He ruled by marriage and inheritance a vast empire stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. The marriage also united two people who were, in many ways, perfectly matched. Both were brilliant, ambitious, and ruthless. Both had tempers that could shake the walls of any castle. Their relationship would be one of the great love stories and great hate stories of the Middle Ages. It would produce 8 children, including 2 of the most famous kings in English history, Richard the Lionheart and John. And it would produce a dynasty that would change England forever. In 1153, Henry invaded England. The Civil War had been dragging on for nearly 2 decades, and the country was exhausted. Henry's forces met Stephen's at Wallingford Castle, and for a moment it looked like the war would be settled on the battlefield. But instead of fighting, the 2 sides negotiated. Stephen, by this point, was old and weary. His own son had died, so he had no obvious heir. So the deal was simple. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but Henry would be his successor. Stephen died in October 1154. And on December 19th, 1154, Henry II was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey, alongside his queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine. He was 21 years old. He was the first Plantagenet king, and he was about to transform England and his vast continental empire beyond recognition. Henry II has been described as the greatest of the Angevin kings. He was certainly one of the most energetic. Contemporaries spoke of his restless energy, his decisiveness, his constant motion. He never seemed to stop. He was always traveling, always administering, always judging, always fighting. He inherited a kingdom that had been ravaged by 19 years of civil war. The royal authority had been eroded. The barons had built castles everywhere, each one a center of independent power. The legal system was a mess. The finances were a shambles. Henry sorted it out. He demolished the illegal castles. He reasserted royal control over the administration. He reformed the legal system, creating a network of royal courts that gradually supplanted the old feudal courts. He introduced trial by jury, or something close to it. He extended royal justice to all free men, in theory at least. He also created the basis for what would become the English common law. The laws of Henry II weren't written down in a single code. They evolved case by case, precedent by precedent. But by the time he died, the outlines of a coherent legal system were in place. The king's justice was available to anyone who could pay for it, and that was more than had ever been true before. But Henry's greatest achievement, and his greatest problem, was his empire. Henry II ruled more of France than the King of France himself. He was Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, Duke of Aquitaine, and Overlord of Brittany and Wales. He also had influence over Scotland. His territories formed a crescent around the French royal domain, enclosing it on 3 sides. This was the Angevin Empire, though it wasn't really an empire in any formal sense. Henry never called it that. It was just a collection of territories held by a single man, with no unified administration, no common law, no shared identity. But together they made Henry the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. And that made him a problem for the King of France. The French kings of the 12th century were, by comparison, weak. Their direct control extended only over the area around Paris, the Île-de-France. The rest of the country was ruled by powerful dukes and counts who acknowledged the king's authority in theory, but did whatever they wanted in practice. Henry was the most powerful of them all, and Louis VII of France, Eleanor's first husband, resented it deeply. The rivalry between the Plantagenets and the Capetians would shape European politics for centuries. But it wasn't just external threats that Henry faced. His greatest crisis came from within his own kingdom, from a man who had once been his closest friend, Thomas Becket. Becket was the son of a London merchant, a man of humble origins who had risen through talent and determination. He had been Henry's chancellor, his chief minister, and the two men had been inseparable. They hunted together, they feasted together, they plotted together. Henry trusted Becket completely. And so when the Archbishop of Canterbury died in 1162, Henry saw an opportunity. He would make Becket the Archbishop. Becket would run the church in England, but he would also be Henry's man, ensuring that the church cooperated with the king's reforms. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Becket, once appointed, underwent a transformation. He became ascetic, devout, and utterly defiant. He opposed Henry's attempts to bring the church under royal control. He defended the rights and privileges of the clergy against the king's encroachments. He became, in effect, the leader of the opposition. Henry was furious. He felt betrayed by his friend, and in a moment of rage he famously exclaimed, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 of his knights took him at his word. They rode to Canterbury, confronted Becket in the cathedral, and murdered him on the altar steps. The murder of Thomas Becket in 1170 was one of the great scandals of the Middle Ages. The whole of Christendom was horrified. Becket was rapidly canonized, made a saint. Henry was forced to do public penance, walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury while monks flogged him. He had to accept that the church was, in some respects, beyond his control. It was the most humiliating moment of his reign, but it was far from the worst thing that happened to him. Henry had everything. He had power, wealth, and a reputation as the greatest king in Europe. But he could not control his own family. Henry and Eleanor had 8 children, 5 of them were sons. And Henry, like many medieval kings, made the mistake of giving his sons territories of their own while he was still alive. He crowned his eldest son, Henry, as the young king, a junior monarch who would theoretically succeed him. He gave Richard the Duchy of Aquitaine, he gave Geoffrey the Duchy of Brittany, and he gave John, his youngest and favorite son, nothing, which is why John was nicknamed Lackland. The problem was that the sons, once given power, wanted more, and they saw no reason to wait for their father to die. In 1173, the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey rebelled against their father. They were supported by their mother, Eleanor, and by King Louis VII of France. It was the ultimate family betrayal. Henry fought them off, but the rebellion left deep scars. He forgave his sons. He was in many ways a sentimental father, but he never trusted them again. Eleanor, however, he did not forgive. She spent the next 15 years under house arrest. Henry kept her confined, moving her from castle to castle, but always under guard. It was his revenge for her support of their sons. The rebellions continued. The young king died in 1183, still in rebellion against his father. Geoffrey died in 1186. And Richard, now the eldest surviving son, continued to fight his father, supported by Philip II of France, the new French king, who was every bit as ambitious and ruthless as Henry himself. In 1189, Henry was finally defeated. He was forced to accept Richard as his heir and to acknowledge Philip's supremacy. Broken, humiliated, and ill, Henry retired to his castle at Chinon. He died on July 6, 1189. His last words were reportedly, "Shame, shame on a conquered king." Shame, shame on a conquered king. His body was taken to Fontevraud Abbey, where he lies to this day, next to Eleanor and Richard. He was 56 years old. He had ruled for 35 years. And he had created an empire that his successors would never be able to hold together. Richard I is the king of legend, the Lionheart, the Crusader hero, the man who went to the Holy Land and fought Saladin, the man who, according to the stories, was so brave that he once single-handedly fought an entire Saracen army. The reality is rather different. Richard was born in 1157, the third son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. He was given the Duchy of Aquitaine, his mother's inheritance, and he spent most of his early life fighting to control it. He was a brilliant soldier, there's no doubt about that. He was brave, charismatic, and a natural leader of men. He was also, by all accounts, an awful king. Richard's reign lasted from 1189 to 1199. In those 10 years, he spent only about 6 months in England. The rest of the time he was either on crusade, fighting in France, or languishing in a German prison. The crusade was Richard's great passion. In 1190 he set off for the Holy Land as part of the Third Crusade. He fought brilliantly. He won victories. He captured the city of Acre. He came within sight of Jerusalem. But he could never quite take the Holy City. And in the end, he made a truce with Saladin and headed home. On the way back, he was captured by Leopold of Austria, who had a grudge against him. Richard was handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who demanded an enormous ransom for his release. The English people were taxed to the breaking point to raise the money. 100,000 marks, a staggering sum. Richard's mother, Eleanor, who had been released from house arrest, traveled to Germany to negotiate his release. He was finally freed in 1194. He returned to England briefly, just long enough to be crowned again, to reassert his authority, and then he left again, never to return. For the rest of his reign, Richard fought in France. He built a fortress called Chateau Gaillard, the Saucy Castle, to defend Normandy against the French. He fought Philip II to a standstill, and in 1199, while besieging a minor castle in Aquitaine, he was hit in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt. The wound became infected. Richard died on April 6, 1199. He was 41 years old. He had no legitimate children. The legend of Richard the Lionheart began almost immediately. He became the hero of countless romantic stories, the chivalrous king, the brave crusader, the model of knighthood. But the reality was that Richard bankrupted England twice during his reign. He taxed the country mercilessly. He neglected his duties as king. He saw England primarily as a source of money for his wars. He was, as one historian put it, a great soldier and a terrible king. And then came John. John was the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. He was his father's favorite, the only one of his sons who never rebelled against him. He was also the one who inherited the kingdom when Richard died, because Richard had no children and the other brothers were dead. But John inherited a disaster. The treasury was empty. The French king, Philip II, was determined to destroy the Angevin Empire, and John, unfortunately, was the worst possible person to deal with these challenges. John has gone down in history as one of the worst kings England has ever had. He was treacherous, cruel, petty, and incompetent. He was nicknamed Lackland because his father had nothing to give him. He was also called Soft Sword by his contemporaries, not exactly a compliment. John's reign was a catalogue of disasters. He lost Normandy to the French in 1204. He lost Anjou. He lost most of his continental possessions. The Angevin Empire, which Henry II had built with such care, collapsed in just a few years. He also fought with the Pope. In 1208, he was excommunicated. England was placed under an interdict. No church services, no marriages, no burials in consecrated ground. John didn't care. He just confiscated church property and carried on. But his worst enemy was his own barons. John was a tyrant. He taxed his barons without their consent. He confiscated their lands. He threw them in prison on the flimsiest of pretexts. He intervened in legal cases for his own financial gain. By 1215, the barons had had enough. They rebelled. They marched on London. And they forced John to negotiate. The result was one of the most famous documents in history. Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Magna Carta was not, as it's sometimes portrayed, a declaration of human rights. It was a practical document, a peace treaty between a king and his barons. It listed specific grievances and demanded specific remedies. It didn't mention the rights of man or democracy or freedom. It was about feudal law, about the relationship between a king and his noble subjects. But buried in that document were two clauses that would echo through the centuries. One said that no free man could be arrested, imprisoned, or dispossessed except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. The other said that justice could not be sold, denied, or delayed. These were in essence the foundations of due process. They were the beginning of the idea that the king was not above the law. John signed Magna Carta on June 15, 1215, at Runnymede. He had no intention of keeping his word. Within months, he was asking the Pope to annul it. The Pope obliged, and the Civil War resumed. But John never got to enjoy his victory. In October 1216, while crossing the Wash, a stretch of tidal water in eastern England, he lost his baggage train, including the crown jewels. A few days later, he fell ill. He died on October 19, 1216. He was 49 years old. He had ruled for 17 disastrous years, and he left behind a kingdom in chaos, a 9-year-old son as his heir, and a legacy of failure that would never be forgotten. Henry III was crowned in October 1216. He was 9 years old. The country was in the middle of a civil war. The French Prince Louis had been invited by the barons to take the throne. It looked like the Plantagenet Dynasty might be over almost before it had properly begun. But Henry had one advantage: an extraordinary regent. William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, was the greatest knight of his age. He had served 4 kings: Henry II, Richard I, John, and now Henry III. He was old, but he was wise, and he was utterly loyal. He rallied the royalist forces, defeated the French, and secured Henry's throne. Henry grew up to be a very different king from his father. He was pious, cultured, and charitable. He was also weak, indecisive, and easily influenced. He surrounded himself with foreign favorites: his wife's relatives from Provence, his half-brothers from his mother's second marriage. The English barons resented this. Henry's reign was the longest in medieval English history, 56 years, from 1216 to 1272. It was also, for the most part, a failure. Henry poured money into grandiose building projects, most famously the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey. He spent fortunes on wars in France that achieved nothing. He ignored the advice of his barons and ran the kingdom as if it were his personal estate. In 1258, the barons finally snapped. They forced Henry to agree to the Provisions of Oxford, a set of reforms that limited his power and created a council of barons to run the government. Henry agreed, then repudiated the agreement as kings so often did. The result was civil war. Simon de Montfort, the king's brother-in-law and one of the most charismatic figures of the age, led the baronial rebellion. In 1264, de Montfort defeated Henry at the Battle of Lewes and took him prisoner. For a brief moment it seemed that England might become a republic. De Montfort called a parliament that included not just barons and bishops, but also representatives of the shires and boroughs, the first time ordinary people had been involved in government. De Montfort's Parliament of 1265 laid the foundations for the two houses of our modern Parliament. But de Montfort's triumph was short-lived. Henry's son, Edward, escaped from captivity and raised an army. In 1265, he defeated and killed de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham. Henry was restored to the throne, but his authority was shattered. He spent his remaining years as a figurehead while his son Edward effectively ran the kingdom. Henry III died in 1272. He was 65 years old. He had ruled for 56 years, but his true legacy was his son. Edward I was one of the greatest of the Plantagenet kings. He was called Longshanks because of his height. He was over 6 feet tall, a giant in an age when most men were much shorter. He was called the Hammer of the Scots because of his brutal campaigns against Scotland. He was born in 1239, the eldest son of Henry III and Eleanor of Provence. He was a warrior, a lawgiver, and a statesman. He was also ruthless, ambitious, and utterly determined to make England the dominant power in Britain. Edward spent the first years of his reign on crusade. He left England in 1270 to join the Seventh Crusade, and he was still in the Holy Land when his father died. He returned to England in 1274 and was crowned king. His first great achievement was the conquest of Wales. The Welsh princes had been a thorn in the side of the English kings for centuries, but Edward was determined to end the problem once and for all. He built a network of mighty castles, Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, to dominate the Welsh countryside. He defeated the last Welsh prince, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, in 1282. And in 1284 he issued the Statute of Wales, which annexed Wales to the English crown. To symbolize his conquest, Edward made his son, the future Edward II, the first Prince of Wales, a title that has been held by the heir to the English throne ever since. Then Edward turned his attention to Scotland. Scotland in the 1290s was in crisis. The king, Alexander III, had died without a clear heir. Edward was invited to arbitrate between the rival claimants. He chose John Balliol as king, but he made it clear that Balliol was his vassal, that he owed allegiance to the English crown. The Scots didn't like that. In 1295 they formed an alliance with France, the beginning of the Auld Alliance that would last for centuries. Edward invaded Scotland in 1296, defeated the Scots, and took the Stone of Destiny, the coronation stone of the Scottish kings, back to London. But the Scots weren't beaten. In 1297, William Wallace rose in rebellion. Wallace won a stunning victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and for a moment it seemed that Scottish independence was within reach. Edward was enraged. He invaded Scotland again in 1298 and defeated Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk. Wallace was captured in 1305 and executed in the most brutal manner imaginable, hanged, drawn, and quartered. But the Scottish resistance didn't end with Wallace. In 1306, Robert the Bruce had himself crowned King of Scotland. Edward marched north to crush him, but he was old and ill. He died on July 7th, 1307, at Burgh by Sands near the Scottish border. He was 68 years old. His last command was that his bones should be carried on future campaigns against the Scots. His son, Edward II, did carry his father's bones north, but he didn't carry them very far. He turned back and buried his father in Westminster Abbey. Edward I had been one of the most successful Plantagenet kings. He had strengthened the crown and parliament against the old feudal nobility. He had created a unified legal system. He had conquered Wales. He had almost conquered Scotland. But he had also created a problem for his successors, a problem that would take centuries to solve. Edward II was the fourth son of Edward I, and he became king only because his three elder brothers had all died young. He was born in 1284 at Caernarfon Castle in Wales, the first Prince of Wales. He was athletic, intelligent, and keen on the arts. But he was also weak, stubborn, and disastrously influenced by his favorites. Edward's reign was a catastrophe from start to finish. His greatest mistake was his relationship with Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was a Gascon knight who had been Edward's companion since childhood. Edward was devoted to him. In all probability, they were lovers. He gave Gaveston titles and lands that should have gone to the nobility. He allowed Gaveston to insult the barons and treat them with contempt. The barons were furious. In 1311, they forced Edward to agree to reforms, the ordinances of 1311 that limited his power and sent Gaveston into exile. Edward brought Gaveston back, and in 1312 the barons captured and executed him. Edward never forgave them. But he didn't learn from the experience either. He found new favorites, the Despensers, father and son, and gave them the same power and privileges he had given Gaveston. Meanwhile, the Scots were winning. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce defeated the English army decisively. Scotland was effectively independent, and Edward had lost the kingdom his father had fought so hard to conquer. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, was a remarkable woman. She was intelligent, determined, and increasingly disgusted by her husband's behavior. In 1325, she traveled to France, where she met Roger Mortimer, a disgruntled English baron. The two became lovers, and they plotted together to depose Edward. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England. They were supported by the barons who had had enough of Edward's misrule. Edward was captured, deposed, and imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. In September 1327, Edward died. Or rather, he was murdered. The exact details are gruesome and probably apocryphal. According to tradition, a red-hot poker was inserted into his anus. The reality was probably more mundane. He was likely suffocated or strangled. But the manner of his death has haunted the popular imagination. It was a brutal end for a weak king who had been utterly unsuited to the throne. Edward III was just 14 when his father was deposed. He had been crowned in January 1327, but real power lay with his mother Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. In 1330, Edward III had had enough. He staged a coup, arrested Mortimer, and had him executed. His mother was sent into retirement. Edward was now in control, and he proved to be the most successful Plantagenet king since his grandfather, Edward I. Edward III was born in 1312 at Windsor Castle. He was tall, handsome, charismatic, and utterly ruthless when he needed to be. He was also a brilliant military commander, perhaps the greatest of all the Plantagenet kings. His great project was the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was a dynastic struggle between the kings of England and France. It was fought over the question of who should rule France, the French king or the English king, who had a claim to the French throne through his mother. Edward III's claim was, in theory, strong. His mother was Isabella of France, the daughter of King Philip IV. When the French royal line died out, Edward argued that he should inherit the French throne. The French naturally disagreed. They invoked an ancient law called the Salic Law, which barred inheritance through the female line. The war began in 1337. Edward invaded France not once, but many times. He won spectacular victories, most notably at Crécy in 1346 and at Poitiers in 1356, where the English captured the French king, John II. The victories were due to a combination of factors: the English longbow, which could pierce armor at a distance, brilliant tactics, and the sheer quality of the English army, which was composed largely of professional soldiers rather than feudal levies. But the war was also incredibly expensive. Edward taxed his subjects mercilessly to pay for it. And the victories didn't last. The French, though defeated, refused to accept English rule. The war dragged on with no end in sight. In 1348, disaster struck. The Black Death arrived in England. The plague was one of the worst catastrophes in human history. It killed between a third and a half of the population of Europe. In England, perhaps 2 million people died out of a population of about 4 million. The Black Death transformed English society. Labor was suddenly scarce, so wages rose. Peasants could demand better conditions. The old feudal system, which had been creaking for years, was dealt a blow from which it never recovered. Edward III survived the plague. So did his family. But the experience changed him. He became more cautious, more concerned with his own comfort and pleasure. The later years of his reign were less successful than the earlier ones. Edward III died in 1377. He was 64 years old and had ruled for 50 years, the longest reign of any English king up to that point. He was succeeded by his grandson, Richard II. Richard was just 10 years old. He was the son of Edward, the Black Prince, the great warrior who had won the Battle of Poitiers but had died before his father. Richard was, in many ways, the opposite of his grandfather. He was cultured, artistic, and deeply convinced of his own importance. His reign was immediately challenged by the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The revolt was sparked by a new poll tax, a tax that everyone had to pay, regardless of their wealth. It was deeply unpopular, and it triggered a massive uprising across the southeast of England. The rebels were led by a man called Wat Tyler, and they marched on London. The young Richard II showed remarkable courage. he rode out to meet the rebels at Smithfield, and he personally confronted Wat Tyler. When Tyler was killed by the mayor of London, Richard calmed the crowd, promising to grant their demands. Then, when the rebellion collapsed, he broke his promises and had the rebel leaders executed. It was a ruthless performance from a boy of just 14. It showed that Richard, for all his artistic pretensions, was a Plantagenet through and through. Richard II grew up to be a deeply problematic king. He believed that kings ruled by divine right, that they were answerable only to God. He surrounded himself with favorites and ignored the advice of his barons. He also bore a grudge. In 1388, a group of barons, the Lords Appellant, had forced him to accept their control over the government. Richard never forgave them. In 1397, he had the leaders arrested and executed. Richard was now effectively a tyrant. He ruled without parliament, confiscated lands from his enemies, and treated his subjects as if they were his personal property. But he made one fatal mistake. He exiled his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. Bolingbroke was the son of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the uncle of the king. He was popular, wealthy, and ambitious. Richard exiled him in 1398 for no good reason. When John of Gaunt died in 1399, Richard confiscated the Lancaster inheritance, a move that was illegal as well as unwise. Bolingbroke returned to England, landing in Yorkshire in July 1399. He was greeted with widespread support. Richard was captured, deposed, and imprisoned in Pontefract Castle. In 1400, Richard died, or was murdered. The exact details are unclear. He was probably starved to death. He was the last of the main-line Plantagenet kings. The houses of Lancaster and York. Henry Bolingbroke was crowned Henry IV in 1399. He was the first king of the House of Lancaster, the first of 3 Lancastrian kings who would rule England for more than 60 years. But Henry's reign was always precarious. He was a usurper, and he knew it. He had no divine right to the throne. He had taken it by force, and there were others with better claims, the Mortimers, descendants of Edward III's second son, Lionel of Clarence. Henry spent most of his reign fighting rebellions. The Welsh, led by Owain Glyndwr, rose in revolt. The Scots invaded. The Percy family of Northumberland rebelled. Henry survived, but he was exhausted by the struggle. He died in 1413. He was 46 years old. He had ruled for 14 turbulent years, but he had founded a dynasty that would produce one of England's greatest kings. Henry V is, for many historians, the greatest of all English kings. He was born in 1386 or 1387, the eldest son of Henry IV and Mary de Bohun. He was a warrior from his youth. He had fought against the Welsh and against the Percys at the Battle of Shrewsbury. He was also a brilliant administrator, a charismatic leader, and a master of propaganda. Henry's great achievement was the renewal of the 100 Years' War. In 1415, he invaded France with a small army. He laid siege to the port of Harfleur, and then to his astonishment, he was faced by a much larger French army at Agincourt. The Battle of Agincourt is one of the great victories in English history. The English longbowmen decimated the French knights, who were bogged down in the mud. Henry won a crushing victory, and he was hailed as a hero. The war continued for another 5 years. Henry conquered Normandy. He besieged and captured Rouen. And in 1420, he signed the Treaty of Troyes, which recognized him as the heir to the French throne. he married Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the French king. It seemed that Henry had achieved the impossible. He was about to become King of France as well as England. But then, disaster. Henry fell ill, probably with dysentery. He died on August 31st, 1422, at the age of just 35. He had ruled for 9 years. He had achieved more than most kings achieve in a lifetime, and he left behind a kingdom that was, for a moment, the greatest in Europe. But he also left behind a 9-month-old son. Henry VI was the only English monarch ever to be crowned King of France. He was also one of the worst kings in English history. He was born in 1421, the son of Henry V and Catherine of Valois. He came to the throne at just 9 months old. He grew up pious, gentle, and utterly unsuited to the brutal realities of medieval kingship. He was a studious recluse, more interested in religion than in politics. Henry's reign was a disaster from start to finish. The war in France, which had been going so well under his father, turned sour. The French, led by Joan of Arc, began to win. By 1453, the English had lost all their continental possessions except Calais. The 100 Years' War was over, and England had lost. Then, in 1454, Henry suffered a complete mental breakdown. He was incapable of ruling. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, effectively ran the country, but she was deeply unpopular. The vacuum at the center of power was filled by Richard, Duke of York. York was the heir presumptive to the throne. He had a better claim than Henry through his descent from Edward III's second son. He was appointed protector of the realm during Henry's illness. When Henry recovered in 1455, York was dismissed, and that was the spark that ignited the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses were a series of civil wars, fought between the two cadet branches of the Plantagenet family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. They were fought for the throne of England, and they were fought with a brutality that shocked the whole of Europe. The first battle was at St. Albans in 1455. York won. He captured Henry VI and became protector again. But then he lost power again, and the war resumed. The battles came thick and fast. Blore Heath, Northampton, Wakefield. At Wakefield in 1460, York was killed. His head was displayed on a spike above the gates of York, decorated with a paper crown as a mockery of his ambitions. But York's son, Edward, took up the cause. He was tall, handsome, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. He defeated the Lancastrians at Mortimer's Cross in 1461, marched into London, and was crowned Edward IV. Henry VI was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. For a decade, Edward IV ruled effectively. He was a capable administrator, a competent soldier, and a man of considerable charm. He also married a commoner, Elizabeth Woodville, an act that alienated many of his noble supporters. In 1470, the Lancastrians made a comeback. They allied with Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, and they restored Henry VI to the throne. Edward IV fled to Burgundy, but he came back in 1471. He won decisive victories at Barnet and Tewkesbury. Warwick was killed. Henry VI's son, Edward of Westminster, was killed, and Henry VI himself was murdered in the Tower of London. The Wars of the Roses were for a moment over. Edward IV was secure on his throne. Edward IV's later reign was relatively peaceful. He rebuilt the royal finances, reformed the administration, and generally restored the authority of the crown. But he died in 1483 at just 40 years old. He left behind two young sons, Edward, aged 12, and Richard, aged 9. The boys were taken to the Tower of London for their safety, it was said. Their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed protector. And then Richard made his move. He declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, that the king had been secretly betrothed to another woman before he married Elizabeth. Therefore, the children were illegitimate. Richard was the rightful king. Richard III was crowned in 1483, and shortly afterwards the two boys in the tower disappeared. They were never seen again. The princes in the tower became one of the great mysteries of English history. Richard III ruled for just 2 years. He was a capable administrator and a competent soldier, but he was deeply unpopular. He had usurped the throne, and he had almost certainly murdered his own nephews. In 1485, a Welsh nobleman called Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army. He marched to Bosworth Field, where he met Richard's forces. Richard was killed in the battle. His crown was found in a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry's head. Henry VII was crowned. He married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, uniting the two warring houses. The Wars of the Roses were over. The Plantagenet Dynasty was finished. The legacy. The Plantagenets ruled England for 331 years. They provided 14 kings, 6 of whom belonged to the cadet houses of Lancaster and York. They presided over some of the most dramatic events in English history. The signing of Magna Carta, the conquest of Wales, the 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses. They also left behind a legacy that endures to this day. The Plantagenets transformed England from a feudal kingdom into a centralized state. They created the common law, the parliamentary system, and the idea that the king is subject to the law, an idea that would eventually lead to constitutional monarchy and democracy. They also left a genetic legacy. Almost every European royal family is descended, in some way, from the Plantagenets. Queen Elizabeth II was a Plantagenet descendant through her mother and through her father, as in fact are all modern British monarchs, but the Plantagenets are also a cautionary tale. They were a family defined by ambition, by greed, by the relentless pursuit of power. They turned on each other, betrayed each other, murdered each other. They brought England to the brink of ruin, and they nearly destroyed themselves in the process. Their story is the story of human nature at its best and worst, of great achievement and terrible failure, of love and hate, loyalty and betrayal, triumph and tragedy. And what of the name itself? Plantagenet. It comes from the broom plant, the Plantagenista, that Geoffrey of Anjou wore in his hat. It was a humble beginning for a dynasty that would dominate England for more than 3 centuries. But there's something fitting about it. The broom plant is tough, resilient, and persistent. It grows in poor soil. It can survive harsh conditions. And once it takes root, it's almost impossible to get rid of. The Plantagenets were like that. They were tough. They were resilient. They survived disasters that would have destroyed any other dynasty. And when they finally fell, they left behind a kingdom that would never be the same again. The Tudors who succeeded them, Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, were Plantagenet descendants too. The Stuarts who followed them were Plantagenet descendants. The Hanoverians, the Windsors, all of them are Plantagenet descendants. In a sense, the Plantagenets never really ended. They just changed their name. So when you think of the Plantagenets, think of Henry II, the restless king who created an empire. Think of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the brilliant queen who survived everything that life threw at her. Think of Richard the Lionheart, the warrior king who was never there. Think of John, the tyrant who was forced to sign Magna Carta. Think of Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, who built castles that still stand today. Think of Edward II, the tragic king who was deposed and murdered. Think of Edward III, the warrior king who started the 100 Years' War. Think of Richard II, the divine king who was brought down by his own arrogance. Think of Henry IV, the usurper who founded a new dynasty. Think of Henry V, the greatest of them all, who died too young. Think of Henry VI, the lost king who went mad. Think of Edward IV, who won the crown and then lost it. Think of Richard III, the last Plantagenet king who died on a battlefield in Leicestershire. Think of all of them, the triumphs and the tragedies, the greatness and the failure. They were the Plantagenets. They were England's longest dynasty, and their story is one of the greatest stories ever told.